All right, man. Peace. This is a very entertaining movie that Chris Rock did a couple years ago. I think 2 or 3 years ago, called Top Five. I watched it about a couple months ago. I noticed a scene, and I saw that it was coming back on, so I DVR'd it. And Chris Rock is going to he's going to corroborate, or he's going to add his little testimony to a sentiment that I put out, about a month or so ago about the film Planet of the Apes, showing you the spiritual aspect of the so-called black male. When he's kind of in his right mind, he can see things and understand things that other people cannot see. So now he's having a conversation with this liberal black female played by Rosario Dawson. And this film is going to show you a few things. It's going to show you, number one, that he understands what the film Planet of the Apes, so that series, is actually about. And it's also going to show you the conundrum that the so-called intelligent black male, quote unquote, so-called black male, is in, the conundrum that he's in when trying to explain things to liberal black females. All right. Like I constantly say, it's you, black male, that is behind enemy lines, not them. Okay. They like this environment, even though most of them will try to protest. And I say the liberal black female does. All right. So-called black females that are watching this video, if you offended, it's probably because it's talking about you. Okay. But just watch how they interact. Watch her inability to understand what he's saying. And also watch the sentiment that she's trying to push on him in regards to the liberal nonsense.
It's staring you right in the face, right? Every Planet of the Apes movie is about race. Everyone.
He said every Planet of the Apes movie is about race. Everyone, because he understands that the apes represent the so-called black man. All right. The Planet of the Apes series is about the so-called Caucasian's fear of black rulership. Is based on his understanding of the previous so-called black rulership during the Middle Ages. All right. And it's also based on his understanding of the scriptures and what they actually prophesy about, which are prophecies that are not taught in the regular church system. These so-called elite Caucasians, they understand what the Bible's really saying and what it's actually talking about. So that is their fear. All right. So now let's see how she responds when he says that the Planet of the Apes series is all about race. Let's see how she responds.
Yeah, I'm assuming you're talking about the trilogy that starts off with Charlton Heston frolicking naked with a black astronaut.
Well, first off, the Planet of the Apes was not a trilogy. It was actually 5 films, so she's already wrong. But the film was written very well because it shows you that most of these liberal females, they talk and they don't know what they're talking about. Number one, they're more concerned about pushing their propaganda. But she said that it showed Charlton Heston frolicking with a black astronaut. You should see the original film. It actually is about 4 astronauts. It's three white males, or so-called Caucasian males, a black male, and a white female. All right, pardon me. It's 2 Caucasian males, a black male, so-called black male, and a white female, and they're basically on a journey to find life in outer space. They end up getting caught in a time warp. And their job is to populate whatever new planet they find. And when they get to the new planet, the Caucasian female is dead. So it's just the so-called black male astronaut with the 2 white male astronauts. The reason why they put the black male astronaut in the film is to try to throw off what the film was actually about. And that's a technique that they will often do in Hollywood films, Hollyweird films. They'll often throw a black character in the film that you don't really understand why he or she is in the film, particularly he. You don't understand why he's in the film, but he's in the film to throw off what the intent of the film was actually about, which is to show that the so-called apes represent black rulership. But you don't want to make it that apparent if you had all 3 white astronauts. All right.
That typical sci-fi movie that's about the future and about how the human race is out of control. Yep.
You see, she's more concerned about the so-called human race because she's a globalist, like most liberal females are, particularly liberal black females. Like I said, the liberal black female, for those of you brothers who always want to put the female on a pedestal, the so-called liberal black female is like a triple agent. She's a globalist. She's a fake racialist, meaning she gets involved with racial issues only when it suits her, or when it can assist her in getting attention. But her number one personality is that she is a mega feminist. All right. That is her main alter ego, is as a mega feminist. So her job is to always try to talk down the black man, so-called black man, whenever he comes to these revelations, to make him feel like he's crazy. That's her role in this conversation, is to try to talk down Chris Rock, make him feel like what he's saying is a figment of his imagination. All right. It's like I've said before, a lot of you brothers, you should watch a film Arnold Schwarzenegger did almost 30 years ago called Total Recall. And I liken the so-called black female to the character, the so-called liberal black female, to the Sharon Stone character in Total Recall. Her job was to keep Arnold Schwarzenegger's character asleep, keep him comfortable. All right. He didn't understand that she was a paid agent whose job it was to make sure that he stayed in his delusion. Once he started to snap out of his delusion, he saw that she was trying to kill him as much as everybody else. All right. Does that mean every so-called black female is the enemy? No. Just the so-called liberal black ones that embrace the propaganda of this society. All right. They are not your allies, brothers. Once again, you are behind enemy lines, not them. All right. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to talk about racial issues only when it will get them attention or when it directly affects them. They are not concerned with the overall thought process that it takes to overcome the issues that are actually pertinent. All right. So, but now let's get back to this conversation. She's trying to dissuade him from the understanding that the Planet of the Apes films are actually about race and about the Caucasian man's fear of black rulership. She says it's about the human race against apes.
Yeah, it's about race, but the human race.
No. It's about the white man's fear of a black planet.
You see that? The so-called black man understands what the film is about because he understands, once again, he is the enemy, not her. All right. Now, I know a lot of you brothers don't believe in the Bible, but when you read Exodus, the 2nd chapter, keep in mind, what did Pharaoh say? He said, kill the male children, let the females live. OK, the female child is not a threat. I don't care how strong a so-called, that's why I laugh at that nonsense about the so-called strong black woman. I laugh at that sentiment about the black woman as God. You cannot be a God if nobody's scared of you. Nobody's worried about that. The word God means power. All right. All this stuff is about is the disempowerment of the so-called black male. You keep him disempowered by keeping him confused. You make sure that he stays confused by making sure that the so-called black female feeds him information that is disinformation or misinformation. All right. But Chris Rock's character sees through a lot of the sentiment of the films. And we're going to go through the Planet of the Apes series, most likely in the Chronicles at the movie series, because it's very, very blatant. But she doesn't get it, partly because she doesn't want to get it, and partly because there's really nothing in it for her, for the so-called black man to be in power. All right. And a lot of you brothers don't understand that. The so-called man of color, when he's in power, he's not there to really placate to a lot of the liberal ideologies that the females of color and that all females, liberal females, embrace. The homosexual movement, the feminism, transgenderism, all these things you'll find that most young females today, no matter what race, they embrace. All right. And they will mostly get that through the Caucasian male, who is the most likely to promote those type of ideologies. But let's continue on.
Planet. The darker apes are bigger and stronger. The lighter apes are smarter. This racist bullshit.
You see, he said the darker apes are bigger and stronger. The lighter apes are smarter. When you watch the Planet of the Apes film, the original one, and look at her face, she's looking at her face like, yeah, okay, nigger, whatever. You see, the darker apes in the Planet of the Apes films, they represent the military. And then you had the lighter apes who were the chimps. They were the scientists. And then the lightest apes were the orangutans. They were the spiritual leaders. All right. That's part of the so-called colorism that is promoted in the so-called black community today.
Do you realize that the original Planet of the Apes came out on April 3rd, 1968? Now, we both know what happened the next day.
Martin Luther King was killed.
You see that? That film was put out on that date for that purpose, to to signify that the chief ape that the so-called Caucasian had put in the spotlight was going to be assassinated the next day. Even she picked up on it at the very end. Martin Luther King was a pawn anyway. He was a pawn of Bayard Rustin, who was a homosexual black communist, and he was also a pawn of Stanley Levinson, who was a Caucasian Jew communist who was reporting to a KGB agent named Isidore Needleman. I'll probably do a video on Martin Luther King later on, but most of that was contrived. Then Martin Luther King, he was totally bugged out of his mind. All right, he's a false idol who was set up for so-called blacks to keep them under control. You notice whenever whenever these so-called Caucasian wants to put blacks back in control, they'll read you a Martin Luther King quote. All right, he's a control mechanism. He's a trigger to bring back the controlled alter ego of the so-called black consciousness in America. Right? Whenever they're about to rabble rouse, they read your Martin Luther King quote. Right? But yeah, Martin Luther King, he was all over the place. He was what you would call today a quote unquote illuminist. He wanted everybody to come together, but he was overly infatuated with white females. He loved to sleep with white prostitutes. All right? He had a lot of liberal Caucasian supporters, especially on the West Coast, and he used to like to sleep with their wives. Right, as well as, like I said, white prostitutes. He got caught in Norway chasing a white prostitute down the hallway when in a hotel that he was staying in when he went to accept his Nobel Peace Prize. Allegedly. All right. And like I said, Bayard Rustin, his guru, the guy who taught him about the so-called nonviolent approach, he was a plant that was sent in by the communists. He also is the one who introduced Martin Luther King to Stanley Levinson, who was the brainchild behind the I Have a Dream speech. All right. That's why the FBI was watching Martin Luther King and accused him of communist ties, because he was a communist. You could look up Martin Luther King, Google Martin Luther King and the Communist Training School, and you'll see him there with Ralph Abernathy and that other communist so-called strong black female, Rosa Parks, who also happened to be a lesbian, allegedly. That whole thing with her on the bus was a setup. She was on they had her go on the bus because there was a young black female who was on the bus who had refused to give up her seat, who happened to be pregnant. And she's the one who really started the whole thing. But she was not a member of the SCLC. So what they did was they had Rosa Parks go on the bus and do the same exact thing and stage it so that they can give all the credit to her, and that would allow Martin Luther King to jump in. All right, so that whole thing was staged. I can't remember the young so-called black female's name who was pregnant, who was the original person who actually was the one who refused to give up her seat. But they said, we can't use her because she's not a member of the SCLC. Plus, it'll be a bad vision or bad visual, pardon me, because she's pregnant. She was like 14 or 15 and she was pregnant. I can't remember her name. It was a young sister with glasses. She wore thick rim glasses, but she happened to be pregnant. And she refused to give up her seat. So that there was a big hullabaloo going on about it. But they said, we can't use her as the visual for this because she's not a member of the SCLC and she also is pregnant. It's going to be a bad look. So they brought in Rosa Parks and had her mimic the same thing, refused to give up her seat. And that was the gateway that they needed to plug in Martin Luther King in regards to the so-called bus boycotts. All right. But read about that man. He didn't have any answers at the end. He was totally stressed out. He was a alcoholic, allegedly, or plunging into alcoholism, marijuana use, allegedly. He was all over the place. All right, but his usefulness came to an end, and they did away with him. But I may do a video about him later on. Like I said before, his Fingali was a man named Bayard Rustin. You could look him up. A guy who came in, he used the civil rights movement as a Trojan horse. I'm talking about Bayard Rustin. He wanted to use the civil rights movement as a Trojan horse in order to really push the so-called gay rights movement because he was a homosexual. All right. He used to take baths with Martin Luther King, who was a sex addict. Okay, Martin Luther King was a so-called pansexual. All right, but that's a whole nother story. And a lot of those those events that happened down south with the fire bombings and stuff, those things were staged. All right, those were staged by a lot of white or Caucasian liberal communist groups to get attention and to get sympathy for the so-called quote unquote black civil rights movement. People like James Dombrowski and the Bradens, I believe their name was Carl and Ann Braden. They staged a lot of those events, those cross burnings and fire bombings, to get sympathy for the movement. It's what's known as the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, they were trying to infiltrate the so-called U.S. Culture, but the U.S. wanted it anyway because, like I said, they wanted to bring the so-called blacks into the mainstream of society so that everybody could be put under the same propaganda programming at the same time. Plus, they were going to bring in the prison industrial complex. Prior to integration, so-called blacks actually represented the lowest amount of incarcerated people and the highest percentage of married people. After integration, that's when you had the prison industrial complex and then the so-called drug epidemic, which basically was just a way for the U.S. government, the CIA, to launder the drugs that were being brought into America. They needed couriers, and who better than the so-called young black male? You have him launder the drug money, and then you send him to prison, and he becomes basically a stock option. All right. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. This was a good little clip. Peace.